Sherri Rasmussen was a 29-year-old critical care nurse who was enjoying the bliss of her newlywed life. She had married a guy named John in November of 1985, and for the first 3 months of their marriage, they were living it up, spoused out in their cute little condo in Glendale, California. But then on the night of February 24th, 1986, John came home to a horrific scene. He discovered the body of his new bride, who had been badly beaten in some sort of struggle that ended up with her demise. Police investigated multiple leads on Sherri's case, but with no solid evidence found, Sherri's case eventually went cold, and the case would remain unsolved for over 20 years. But then, one day, the LAPD's cold case squad decided to take another crack at the case with a new piece of technology that wasn't available back in the day: DNA testing. Forensic experts ran a DNA test on a bite mark that was found on Sherri's body, and they were hit with a shocking new suspect, one of LAPD's own, Stephanie Lazarus. So how did this distinguished LAPD officer end up with her DNA on some victim's body from a crime that happened only 20 years ago when she was only in her 20s herself? Well, in 1986, Stephanie was working the streets as a patrol officer, but she had also just come out of a long-term relationship with a man named John. And there were also a lot of Johns out there, so it sounds like the name could have been just a coincidence. But Stephanie's John was in fact the same John that Sherri tied the knot with. Ding, 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 ding! There it is. But even though it seems like a very obvious connection and motive to us, the cops never looked into it or suspected Stephanie at the time. Why? When the investigators first began working on Sherri's case, they were focused on the theory that it was robbery gone wrong. Sherri's silver BMW was missing from the house, and expensive stereo equipment had been stacked next to Sherri's body. They further believed this when two men committed an armed robbery against a woman nearby, just days after Sherri's slaying. A few months later, the same guys threatened another unsuspected woman's life when she accidentally walked into her home while they were in the middle of robbing it. God, I literally hate when I just accidentally walk into my own home. Well, that woman's house was just a few blocks from Sherri's, so the cops were convinced that the two crimes were connected. The woman from the robbery walk-in described the intruders as Latino men between 5'4" and 5'6". And at that point, investigators pinned those unknown men as the primary suspects in Sherri's case. But months went by and the two men were never found. Something that didn't check out about this robbery though was that investigators noted that although Sherri's car had been stolen, nothing else from the house was missing except for one thing that could have been a major clue: Sherri and John's wedding license. Oh, another detail that didn't really add up. I mean, the bite marks left on Sherri's arm was by the attacker. According to forensic psychologists and all the other true crime story documentaries that I watch, bite marks are typically indicated that it's a crime of passion and that the perpetrator knew the victim. Nowadays, bite marks are super helpful in identifying who the attacker is, because you can use the dental impressions and DNA analysis to find out who those chompers belong to. But when the cops found Sherri's body, it was 1986 and DNA testing was still in development. Of course, DNA testing was still brand new and not widely available, so one smart little detective saw the bite on Sherri's arm and was like, I'm gonna take a little swab for this later here, just in case we need it for future. Well, after months of no progress in the case, Sherri's parents held a press conference and asked if anyone knew anything about what had happened to their daughter. They even offered a $10,000 reward, but no one came forward with clues during that time, and the parents were absolutely heartbroken. Now, Sherri's dad was a smart man because he actually suspected Stephanie from the very beginning. He told police that Stephanie and Sherri had both dated John, and that at one point, Sherri told him that Stephanie had shown up at the hospital she worked at to threaten her. Stephanie told Sherri, if I can't have John, nobody else will. That's brutal. A few months later, Sherri told her dad that she came home from work to find Stephanie waiting for her inside her condo. That's gnarly. Stephanie was in her uniform and once again threatened Sherri, who was afraid that Stephanie had been stalking her on the streets. When Sherri's dad told the cops about Stephanie and Sherri's girl drama, they told him that he watched too much television and immediately dismissed the whole thing. I'm sorry, how can you not be a little suspicious of a crazy ex-girlfriend who's literally showing up and making threats to the new wife? I think that at the time, the cops just truly couldn't believe it could be one of their own. And they were so set on the robbery thing that they started to get tunnel vision. Sherri's dad wrote stacks on stacks of letters to the head of the police department pleading for him to take on another look at the case, but they just ghosted him. When officials couldn't make any progress on Sherri's case, it eventually got shelved and sent to the cold case unit. After 5 years of begging and pleading, Sherri's dad gave up trying. But in 2009, the cold case squad had a bunch of time on their hands and decided to reopen some of the cases, including Sherri's. Officials used new DNA technology discovered that the saliva on Sherri's body belonged to a female, and the detectives were shook. Like, here's the entire investigation that had been set up around these two male suspects for years, and in a matter of a few hours, the entire theory was disproved. So now they had to go back and look at the list of 5 females in the case who the detectives believed were possible suspects at the time. The suspects are listed from most to least suspicious, and Stephanie was number 5 on that roster. The detectives reworked the case and looked into the other 4 women. Slowly but surely, they're able to rule them out one by one until there's only one strawberry left in the basket: Stephanie Lazarus. In the case file, the detectives also found the letters Sherri's dad had sent to the authorities begging them to look into Stephanie. Once that discovery was made, officials decided to get a sample of Stephanie's DNA. The detectives, of course, just couldn't outright ask for a swab without Stephanie becoming suspicious. So they followed her around for an entire day until she finally tossed an empty soda cup. That's smart thinking right there. The detectives immediately snatched it out of the trash and sent it to the labs for testing. And not long after that, Stephanie's DNA popped up as a perfect match. Now at this point, the officers working the case were faced with an insane idea that the lady who worked next door to them for the past 20 years was officially suspect numero uno. But now they face an even bigger problem. How do they investigate Stephanie without her knowing? Because Stephanie, being a cop, obviously knew exactly how interrogators work and would zip her lid if she was aware of being questioned. There was also the fact that she was never not armed at work, so the detectives needed to make sure that she didn't have her weapon on her in case she got suspicious and popped off. Apparently the detectives on the case were so terrified of saying or even writing Stephanie's name down because she was so well known throughout the force, and detectives loved to gossip, so they hatched a plan. They selected 2 detectives that didn't know Stephanie to question her. So since they didn't know her, they wouldn't have any bias for or against her in the case. In the end, the detectives decided that they were going to ask Stephanie to help them interview a pretend jailed suspect who they claimed had information on an art theft case. Smart thinking, again. Because they would be going to the jail division, all 3 officers have to surrender their weapons upon arrival before going through security. Next, the 2 not undercover officers planned to take Stephanie into a room that would be set with recording devices. There they would start off by discussing the art theft case and casually shift gears to Sherri's case. The goal was to keep Stephanie talking as long as possible before she figured out what was going on and asked for a lawyer. And on the morning of June 5th, 2009, the grand plan began. A detective, while wearing a wire, stopped by Stephanie's desk and introduced himself. He lied and said that he had a suspect in jail and was talking about art theft. And since he wasn't exactly familiar with that stuff, he asked if Stephanie could try talking to him. And Stephanie was like, sure thing. So Stephanie and the 2 sleuthy detectives headed to the jail division. They surrendered their weapons and sat down to discuss the fake perp. As soon as Stephanie's bum hit the chair, her coworkers told her that they were actually investigating a cold case from 20 years ago. The detectives told Stephanie that her name showed up in the files, so they wanted to question her in a private place away from gossiping colleagues. At first, Stephanie was really taken back, but the detectives assured her that the questioning wouldn't take too long. They claimed that they were just following standard protocol and told her that she could leave whenever she wanted. Of course, the last part was only kind of true. She could leave whenever she wanted, but she would be walking right into the waiting handcuffs of the authorities because she was going to be arrested regardless of what came out of her mouth. Stephanie's entire hour-long interrogation is on YouTube, and you can watch her immediately panic and act dumbfounded when the detectives start questioning her. It's honestly one of the most satisfying things you'll ever watch as Stephanie began to spiral and just lie through her teeth. The investigators started by asking Stephanie if she knew John. She said she did and claimed she met him at UCLA and dated him for a little bit, but it was like a million years ago. Ugh. They even asked her if she knew Sherri. Stephanie claimed that she never met the girl, but she knew she was John's wife who was attacked in a robbery gone wrong. The detectives ended up getting Stephanie to talk for a whopping 68 minutes, never letting on if she was being questioned as a suspect or a witness. Every time Stephanie asked them what the question was all about, they reassured her that they were just trying to get as much info as they could, and they kept telling her she was free to leave whenever she liked. Finally, when the detectives asked Stephanie if she would be willing to give a DNA sample, she realized what was going on and asked for a lawyer. So as soon as she asked for legal counsel, the detectives knew that she was done talking. So they stood her up and marched her into the waiting arms of the authorities, where she was immediately arrested. When it hit the news that 49-year-old police detective Stephanie Lazarus was being arrested, the police department was stunned. Officers said that never in their wildest dreams could they have imagined Stephanie was capable of doing something like that. She was often described as this bubbly, vivacious person who made homemade soaps and chocolate cherries as Christmas presents for neighbors. That sounds nice. But as we've quickly learned by now, just because someone is capable of doing good things doesn't necessarily mean that they're incapable of doing bad things. Sherri's dad held a press conference the day of Stephanie's court appearance, and after 23 years of writing letters, making phone calls, and pleading with the PD, he finally got to say the big ol' "I told you so." The public was shocked to hear the numerous attempts that Sherri's dad had made in trying to get the LAPD to look into one of their own. They couldn't believe that a woman with problematic behavior was brought up as a suspect on day one, to never be looked into again until 2 decades later. Despite the frustration that the police wouldn't listen to Sherri's family about Stephanie's questionable involvement, they were extremely pleased and relieved to know that their daughter's assailant was finally behind bars. And because hindsight is 2020, as soon as Stephanie was arrested, a bunch of new details came out that slowly helped the detectives put the pieces of the parfait together. One of those key pieces was the weapon. Sherri had been found bludgeoned and had ultimately expired when Stephanie fired 3 rounds into Sherri's chest. Detectives at the time were able to conclude that the weapon used was a .38 caliber, which was the same caliber Glock issued to LAPD officers at the time of the incident. Say what? Wait, no one put that together until later? Oh my gosh, that same week, Stephanie called the Santa Monica PD to report that her car had been broken into near the infamous Santa Monica Pier. She reported that her gym bag, money, clothes, and trusty .38 caliber Glock had been stolen. So the same week, Sherri was discovered. Stephanie reported her missing weapon, which matched the scene, and not one person was suspicious about it? Well, apparently, because she reported it to the Santa Monica PD, the Los Angeles PD wasn't notified right away, and the departments were never able to put 2 and 2 together. Of course now, 20 years later, the cops believe that Stephanie most likely just chucked that thing into the Pacific Ocean. Another detail that came out was that the crime scene was way worse than originally revealed. Now, Sherri's head had been brutally bludgeoned and the marks of her wrists suggested that she had been tied up. Those details didn't match the MO of the other robberies in the area and definitely lent itself to the theory that Lazarus attacked Sherri in a jealous fit of rage. On June 9th, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus walked into the courtroom for her arraignment, but instead her usual officer blues she had worn so many times before, she found herself on the other side of the law in the orange jumpsuit. Her eyes were wide open and she looked absolutely frazzled. She spoke only once and answered the judge with, "Yes, Your Honor." Stephanie went to trial in 2012 where she was found guilty of slaying Sherri in the first degree and was sentenced to 27 years in prison. To this day, Stephanie is still behind bars, but will be eligible for parole in 22 years. Seriously, wow, this is one of the more upsetting cases when you find out just how far the police would go to protect one of their own. And to think that Sherri's dad knew who had hurt his daughter the entire time, and no one would believe him. I'm so glad that Sherri and her family finally got that sweet, sweet justice. And speaking of sweet, I'd say that our strawberry shortcake is just about done. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.